Bryce Johnson is the data analyst on Expedition Bigfoot, the person whose job it is to process every piece of field evidence the investigation produces, and to build from that evidence the predictive model whose outputs have been guiding the investigation's deployment decisions across every season of the show's run. He does not break news. He processes it, which is why what he just broke about Expedition Bigfoot has produced the specific quality of stunned attention that his prior public communications about the investigation have never generated. Subscribe and stay until the very end. Bryce Johnson's contribution to Expedition Bigfoot has been the most consistently undervalued element of the show's production in the public conversation about what the investigation represents and what it has produced. The format that the show's broadcast presentation established for his role, the data analyst, the tech guy, the person who sits behind screens processing information that the field team generates while Ronnie LeBlanc and Dr. Mireya Mayor are in the forest doing the physically dramatic work, is an accurate description of his operational function within the investigation, and a significant understatement of what that function actually means for the investigation's capability and for the quality of what the investigation produces. Bryce Johnson's academic background in data science and computational analysis gives the Expedition Bigfoot investigation something that no comparable cryptid investigation show has ever possessed: a rigorous, quantitative, methodologically defensible framework for processing field evidence whose application to the investigation's accumulated dataset produces outputs whose predictive accuracy has been one of the show's most consistently documented achievements. The predictive model he built and has been refining across the show's seasons is not a dramatic visual element whose broadcast presentation captures what makes it significant. It is a systematic analytical framework whose inputs are the full body of evidence the investigation generates: track evidence, acoustic recordings, thermal data, biological samples, witness accounts, structural evidence documentation, and the geographic and temporal distribution of all of it, and whose outputs are probability assessments, whose accuracy the subsequent field sessions have validated at a rate that the investigation's production record documents. When Bryce Johnson says the model points somewhere, the investigation goes there and finds something. That is not a television narrative device. It is a documented operational fact about the investigation's evidence-driven decision-making process. The specific credibility that track record gives his public communications about the investigation's findings is the foundation on which understanding why what he just broke as news is significant rests. He is not a presenter whose enthusiasm drives his claims. He is an analyst whose methodology has a documented accuracy record and whose public statements about the investigation's findings reflect the same standards of quantitative rigor that the model whose outputs those statements communicate demands. He just broke news, and what makes it news is what the model whose outputs he is now communicating publicly has produced about the nature of what the Expedition Bigfoot investigation has been finding. The predictive model Bryce Johnson developed for the Expedition Bigfoot investigation did not arrive at its current form in a single season. It is the product of progressive refinement across the full span of the show's production, an analytical framework whose inputs, whose weighting systems, and whose output formats have been developed iteratively in response to what the successive field seasons have produced, and what the model's prior predictions have established about the accuracy of its core assumptions. Understanding what the news Bryce Johnson just broke is about requires understanding what the model has been building, what the accumulation of evidence across every season of Expedition Bigfoot has produced in an analytical system whose entire purpose is to find the patterns in that evidence that the human investigators cannot find through direct observation alone. The first season's evidence contribution to the model established the baseline, the geographic distribution of documented activity across the investigation's first deployment areas, the acoustic signatures whose frequency analysis the model used to establish the species' vocal profile, the track evidence whose dimensional and anatomical characteristics the model incorporated into the physical profile database that subsequent seasons have been testing. The second season added temporal patterning, the specific timing relationships between evidence events within a single deployment that the model identified as non-random, and whose non-randomness established something about the behavioral organization of what the investigation was tracking. The third and subsequent seasons added the geographic and behavioral dimensions whose accumulation across multiple independent deployment areas in different regions allowed the model to begin distinguishing between the evidence of resident populations and the evidence of individual or temporary activity, a distinction whose specific significance for the investigation's population assessment the model's output outputs have been progressively establishing. By the most recent season, the model had accumulated evidence inputs from enough independent geographic areas across enough temporal range to produce outputs whose character Bryce Johnson has described in the limited public references to the model's current state as different in kind, rather than in degree from what any prior season's evidence accumulation had permitted it to generate. The current model is not producing more refined versions of the predictions it has always produced. It is producing something different, a conclusion rather than a probability assessment, and the conclusion it has produced is what he just broke as news. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation's most recent field season produced an evidence contribution to Bryce Johnson's predictive model, whose specific character the model's analytical framework had not encountered in the prior season's evidence inputs in quite the same form or with quite the same convergent character. Multiple independent evidence categories producing findings whose correspondence to each other was not the approximate correspondence of independently generated evidence pointing in the same general direction, the kind of convergence the model had been documenting across prior seasons as its most significant outputs. The most recent season's evidence produced a correspondence whose precision the model's statistical framework characterized as beyond the coincidental overlap of independent evidence streams and consistent with a single underlying reality, whose multiple evidence expressions the investigation had documented simultaneously for the first time in the investigation's history. The acoustic evidence from the most recent season's primary deployment location produced frequency analysis results whose specific harmonic structure Bryce Johnson's model characterized as the most internally consistent vocal signature the investigation's acoustic record has ever captured. Not a single recording whose quality exceeded the prior record. A series of recordings from the same location across multiple sessions whose consistency with each other established a stable vocal profile rather than the variable acoustic evidence that a population of multiple individuals producing independent vocalizations generates, the same source, repeatedly, in a pattern whose geographic and temporal distribution the model's analysis identified as consistent with territorial rather than transient behavior. The physical evidence from the same location produced the second convergent input. Track evidence whose dimensional profile across multiple independent impressions showed a consistency that the model's comparative analysis placed outside the normal variation range that a natural population of individuals produces. A consistency consistent with a single individual whose territory was centered on the investigation's primary deployment location, and the thermal evidence from the sessions at that location added the third convergent input, signatures at a specific position within the deployment area whose recurrence across independent sessions at predictable intervals. The model's temporal analysis characterized as consistent with a fixed denning or resting site, rather than the variable thermal evidence of a population moving through a territory. 3 independent evidence categories. 1 location, 1 individual, a fixed site. That convergence is what changed the model's output from a probability assessment to something more specific. The output that Bryce Johnson's predictive model has produced from the most recent season's evidence convergence is what the news he is breaking consists of, and it is an output whose character distinguishes it from every prior season's most significant model output in a specific way, whose understanding requires engaging with what the prior outputs looked like and how the current output differs from them. The prior season's most significant model outputs were probability assessments, quantitative characterizations of the likelihood that a specific geographic area contained a resident population of the unknown species the investigation has been tracking. The model expressed those assessments in the specific language of data analysis, probability percentages attached to geographic zones, confidence intervals whose widths reflected the evidence density available for each assessment, and directional predictions whose accuracy the subsequent field deployments tested against the actual evidence they produced. The model's deployment predictions across the prior seasons have been accurate enough that the show's production record constitutes a documented validation of the underlying analytical framework. The investigation has consistently found significant evidence in the locations the model identified as high probability, and has consistently found less significant evidence in the locations the model identified as lower probability. That predictive track record is the foundation on which the current output significance rests, because the current output is not a probability assessment. It is not an expression of the likelihood that something is present somewhere. It is a characterization of a specific location as the confirmed territory of a confirmed individual, a model output that moves from the probabilistic language of prediction into the specific language of documented fact. The model has enough evidence of sufficient consistency and sufficient convergence to characterize a specific location as the active territory of a specific individual of the unknown species whose existence the investigation has been building the evidence base to confirm. Not probably active, not likely inhabited, confirmed active. The model has enough evidence to say that something specific is in a specific place with a regularity and a consistency whose documentation across multiple independent evidence categories and multiple independent field sessions meets the analytical standard that Bryce Johnson's framework requires for the confirmed rather than the probable characterization. That is the output. That is the news, and what it means for everything the Expedition Bigfoot investigation has been building towards since the first season is what the remaining sections of this video establish completely. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation's most significant model output, the confirmed territory characterization whose existence and whose character Bryce Johnson's news establishes in the public record, is not in any broadcast episode. The information is in the production archive. The model's analytical output is documented in the investigation's internal record. The field evidence whose convergence produced the confirmed characterization is documented across the investigation's complete evidence record, whose existence the broadcast episodes have always implied without fully representing. Discovery Channel has had access to the information since the field season whose evidence produced the model's output was completed. Their editorial review of the investigation's findings from that season, whose most significant output is the confirmed territory characterization that Bryce Johnson's news is now communicating publicly for the first time, produced a response whose pattern is consistent with the prior history of the network's handling of the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's most significant evidence. The confirmed territory characterization is not in the broadcast record of the season that produced it. What is in the broadcast record is a presentation of the season's evidence, whose relationship to the complete record reflects the editorial management that the network's ongoing search commercial premise applies to findings whose character exceeds what the ongoing search format can accommodate without concluding the search. A confirmed territory characterization is not approach evidence. It is arrival evidence. The broadcast format can present approach evidence within the ongoing search framework, whose commercial value to the network depends on the search's continuation. It cannot present arrival evidence within that framework without concluding the premise whose continuation the franchise's commercial value depends on. Discovery Channel's editorial decision about the confirmed territory characterization reflects that commercial calculation rather than any scientific uncertainty about the validity of the model's output. The output is valid. The evidence is real. The confirmation is in the model. What the network decided to do with that confirmation is what has kept it out of the broadcast record, and what Bryce Johnson's public communication is now changing. The specific implications of a confirmed territory characterization in the context of the Expedition Bigfoot investigation are what make Bryce Johnson's news the most significant communication the show has ever generated, and understanding those implications requires engaging with what a confirmed territory characterization means within the specific analytical framework that his model applies to the investigation's evidence. A territory is not simply a geographic area where evidence of a species has been found. It is a geographic area that an individual of that species uses in a specific and patterned way, returning to specific locations within it at predictable intervals for predictable purposes, maintaining consistent behavioral patterns across seasonal and temporal variation, and leaving the specific evidence signatures whose consistency over time is what the model's analytical framework requires, before it characterizes the territory as confirmed rather than probable. What a confirmed territory means for the investigation is what it means for any field biology investigation of a species whose geographic distribution and behavioral ecology a research program has been working to establish. It means the investigation now has a specific, documentable, returning subject in a specific, identifiable, predictable location. Not evidence that something was somewhere. Evidence that something is somewhere returns there, and leaves consistent evidence of its presence whose pattern the model can predict with the analytical confidence that the confirmed rather than probable characterization requires. That is the specific operational change the confirmed territory characterization produces for the Expedition Bigfoot investigation. The investigation has been operating as a search across multiple potential territories, whose evidence profiles the model has been assessing for the highest probability deployments. The confirmed territory characterization ends that search phase and begins a different phase, the systematic documentation of a confirmed subject in a confirmed location. That transition from search to documentation is what Bryce Johnson's news represents for the investigation's operational future, and it is what the broadcast format's ongoing search commercial premise cannot accommodate without transforming the show into something whose format the network has not been willing to support. Ronnie LeBlanc and Dr. Mireya Mayer's responses to the confirmed territory characterization that Bryce Johnson's model produced from the most recent season's evidence are the two most significant external validations of the model's output available, because their individual disciplinary frameworks are the most directly relevant to the assessment of what a confirmed territory characterization of this specific character means in the terms that their professional backgrounds provide. LeBlanc's response reflects his accumulated field research experience, whose depth and whose sustained focus on the Pacific Northwest environments where the investigation's most significant evidence has been concentrated gives him the specific comparative context for assessing what a confirmed territory characterization in those environments represents. His public communications about the most recent season's findings have been moving toward the confirmation that Bryce Johnson's news delivers without having previously stated it in the specific terms that the model's output now permits. What LeBlanc has communicated about the most recent season's evidence in the indirect terms his prior public communications have used reflects his awareness of the confirmation's existence combined with the specific professional restraint of someone who understands that the model's output needs to come from the model rather than from his field assessment of the evidence. He has been managing the distance between what he knows the evidence shows and what he has been able to say publicly about what it shows, in the specific careful way that someone who understands the significance of the confirmation maintains that distance when the timing of its public delivery is not yet right. That distance has now closed with Bryce Johnson's public communication. Dr. Mireya Mayer's response reflects her primatology framework's assessment of what a confirmed territory characterization of an unknown large primate species represents in the terms that primate behavioral ecology applies to territorial confirmation evidence. Her academic background makes her the person whose professional assessment of the model's output carries the most specific scientific weight, and her response to the confirmed territory characterization, communicated in the limited terms her professional restraint permits, reflects an engagement with the model's output that treats it as scientifically significant, rather than as an artifact of an enthusiastic data analysis framework whose rigor she might otherwise question. The Bigfoot research community's response to Bryce Johnson's public communication of the Expedition Bigfoot model's confirmed territory characterization is the external dimension of the news whose specific character communicates something about the significance of what the model's output establishes that the research community's own prior engagement with the investigation's evidence had not previously produced. The BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, whose database of systematic encounter documentation represents the most extensive prior evidence base for the species' geographic distribution, has engaged with the confirmed territory characterization in ways whose specific character reflects both the significance of what the model has produced and the specific professional dynamics of a research community whose relationship to the television production that generated the confirmation is complicated by the commercial and institutional distances between academic field research and broadcast documentary investigation. The academic institutions whose biological and anthropological disciplines are the most directly relevant to the scientific assessment of a confirmed territory characterization for an unknown large primate species in North American forest environments have not published responses. Their silence is the most significant element of the research community's response to Bryce Johnson's news, because it is the silence that the prior pattern of institutional engagement with significant Bigfoot evidence has always produced, not the silence of institutions that have assessed the evidence and found it inadequate, the silence of institutions that have not publicly engaged with the evidence because public engagement with a confirmed territory characterization for Bigfoot would require them to assess it against the scientific standards their disciplines apply to comparable evidence from known species, and because that assessment, if conducted honestly, would produce conclusions about the evidence's significance that the institutional culture of the relevant disciplines is not currently equipped to receive without the kind of fundamental framework revision that institutions do not undertake easily or quickly. The academic silence is itself a communication about the evidence's quality. Institutions dismiss evidence that fails to meet their standards. They ignore evidence whose quality requires them to reconsider those standards. Bryce Johnson built a predictive model model and spent multiple seasons refining it against the evidence that the Expedition Bigfoot investigation produced. The model's outputs across those seasons have been accurate enough that their predictive track record constitutes the most rigorous ongoing validation of an analytical framework that any Bigfoot investigation has ever produced. What the model has now produced, and what Bryce Johnson has now broken as news, is the output that the model's progressive refinement across every season of the investigation was always building toward. Not a more refined probability assessment, not a higher confidence interval around a geographic prediction, a confirmed territory characterization. The transition from probable to confirmed in the specific analytical language that his model applies to the investigation's evidence is the most significant single development in the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's history, and what its public communication changes about everything the investigation has built is what this final section of the video establishes. It changes the investigation's operational phase from search to documentation. The search for a high probability location is concluded. The documentation of a confirmed subject in a confirmed territory is what comes next. It changes the broadcast record's relationship to the complete investigation record. The confirmed territory characterization is in the model. It is not in any broadcast episode. The gap between those two facts is the gap between what the investigation has produced and what the audience has been shown, and Bryce Johnson's public communication of the model's output has made that gap impossible to maintain in the terms the network's ongoing search premise requires. It changes what the research community's engagement with the evidence requires. A confirmed territory characterization from a model whose predictive track record is documented constitutes the specific kind of evidence contribution that the relevant scientific disciplines cannot indefinitely ignore without the ignoring becoming a more significant institutional statement than the engagement would have been. And it changes what every prior season's evidence means in the context of the complete investigation record. The prior seasons were building the model's evidence base. The current model's output is what the building produced. Bryce Johnson spent every season of Expedition Bigfoot processing evidence whose accumulation was moving the model toward the output he just broke as news. The model arrived. The news is out. And what comes next for the investigation whose analytical foundation just produced the most significant output in the field's history is the chapter that the confirmed territory characterization has now made possible to write. Dr. Mireya Mayor is a primatologist, a National Geographic explorer, a field scientist whose career has taken her into the most remote and most dangerous wildlife environments on Earth. She has studied great apes in Central Africa. She has conducted fieldwork in conditions that most researchers never experience once across an entire career. She does not use the word attacked lightly, she just used it. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what she says attacked her during this Expedition Bigfoot investigation has no explanation. When someone connected to a paranormal investigation television show claims they were attacked by an unknown creature during a field session, the claim enters a specific interpretive framework that the genre's history has built around it. The framework is skeptical by default, not because the claim is inherently implausible, but because the genre's commercial incentives create strong reasons for dramatic claims to be produced regardless of their evidentiary foundation, and because the audience that follows paranormal documentary programming has encountered enough manufactured drama to have developed a practiced skepticism about the most extreme claims any given production generates. Dr. Mireya Mayor's claim does not enter that framework in the same way that most paranormal investigation attack claims enter it. And the specific reason it does not is the reason her claim is the most significant attack account the Expedition Bigfoot production has ever generated. She is not a television presenter whose paranormal investigation background is the primary credential she brings to the claim. She is a working field scientist whose professional career was built entirely outside the paranormal television format, a primatologist whose fieldwork in Central Africa produced the discovery of a new species of mouse lemur that National Geographic documented in 2002, and whose academic and research credentials are assessed by the institutional scientific community against the standards it applies to fieldwork in the relevant disciplines rather than against the entertainment standards of paranormal television production. When Dr. Mireya Mayor says something happened to her in the field, the interpretive framework that surrounds the claim is not the paranormal television genre's framework of commercial incentive and manufactured drama. It is the framework of a professional field scientist whose relationship to accurate reporting of field events is governed by the same standards of honesty and precision that her academic career depends on. She knows the difference between what can be explained and what cannot. She knows the difference between an encounter that the biological reference of her primatology training accounts for and one that it does not. And she knows the difference between an experience that her professional communication standards permit her to characterize as an attack and one that requires a more careful or more qualified description. She used the word attack in the specific professional context that her credentials create around every public statement she makes about her field experiences. That word means something, and what it means and what the specific character of the attack she describes communicates about what Expedition Bigfoot encountered during the investigation this video documents is what the rest of this video establishes completely. To understand why what Dr. Mireya Mayor says about what happened during this Expedition Bigfoot investigation carries the specific weight it carries, it is necessary to understand what her professional background actually consists of, not the television presenter version of that background that the Expedition Bigfoot format has always provided to its audience, but the complete academic and field research record whose substance distinguishes her from every other person who has ever made a comparable claim in the context of a paranormal documentary production. She holds a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. Her dissertation research focused on primate behavioral ecology, the specific intersection of biological field methodology and ecological systems analysis that gives her the analytical framework for assessing the behavior of large primates in their natural environments with the precision that academic field research demands. Her fieldwork career prior to Expedition Bigfoot includes extensive time in Central Africa, documenting great ape populations in some of the most remote and most physically demanding field environments on the continent, environments whose specific demands on a researcher's physical endurance, situational awareness, and capacity to accurately assess threatening behavior from large primate species gave her the reference framework that her Expedition Bigfoot field experience has been drawing on. The mouse lemur species discovery she made in 2002 is not a marginal contribution to the field. It is the kind of finding whose documentation requires the sustained, methodical, scientifically rigorous field presence that the academic community's peer review process assesses against the highest standards of biological field research. National Geographic's decision to document the discovery reflects their assessment of its significance within the framework of the relevant scientific disciplines, an assessment that the academic community's subsequent engagement with the finding has validated. All of that, the PhD, the fieldwork history, the species discovery, the National Geographic credential, the academic institutional affiliation, is the foundation on which Dr. Mireya Mayor's assessment of what happened to her during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation this video documents rests, not the paranormal television genre's credibility framework, the scientific community's credibility framework, and what her professional assessment of the experience produced in terms of the specific language she chose to describe it. The word attack, delivered in the specific professional context that her credentials create, is the most significant communication the Expedition Bigfoot production has ever generated about the nature of what the investigation has been finding. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation deployment that produced the attack Dr. Mireya Mayor describes was not a standard session whose operational parameters and investigative objectives matched the template that the prior seasons had established. It was a targeted deployment organized around a specific intelligence picture, a convergence of prior field evidence from the deployment area, whose density and whose consistency across independent source categories the research team's assessment process had identified as the strongest location indicator the show had produced across its investigation history. The prior evidence from the area was not the ambiguous, source-uncertain type that the broader Bigfoot field research community's database contains in abundance. It was specific, physically documented, and assessed by the research team's analytical process against the evidentiary standards that Dr. Mireya Mayor's scientific background made the most demanding available to the production. Track evidence from the area showed dermal ridge detail and anatomical proportions that her primatology training identified as consistent with a large primate species, not consistent in the loose sense of a possible match with sufficient interpretive flexibility applied, but consistent in the specific technical sense of measurements and anatomical characteristics falling within the range that the primatological literature establishes for genuine biological impressions from primate species of the relevant size category. Acoustic evidence from the area had been documented across multiple independent recording sessions, whose temporal distribution ruled out single-source contamination, and whose harmonic analysis the production's audio specialist had characterized as consistent with vocal production from a species significantly larger than any known North American wildlife. And structural evidence, nest formations, branch manipulations at heights that excluded the known wildlife species of the area as possible sources, territorial marking whose geographic distribution indicated a resident population operating within a defined range, had been documented across the area in a pattern whose consistency Ronnie LeBlanc's accumulated field research had identified as unlike anything the prior season's most active investigation sites had produced. The deployment was built around that intelligence picture with the specific operational priority of advancing the investigation's evidence documentation into the most active zone the picture identified. Dr. Mireya Mayor's scientific framework was central to the deployment's evidence assessment plan. Her primatology background made her the person most qualified to characterize whatever the investigation's most active zone produced in real time and against the academic reference framework that her field research career had built. What the most active zone produced was not what the deployment plan had been designed around. It was something else. Something whose character Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatology framework registered not as evidence requiring careful scientific assessment, but as a threat requiring immediate physical response. Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of what happened during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's active field session is the account of a scientist whose professional communication standards apply to the description of a field event, the same rigor that her academic work applies to the characterization of research findings, which means that what she says happened is what her professional judgment determined happened within the evidentiary framework her training provides, rather than what the entertainment format she was working within would have been commercially incentivized to produce. The attack did not begin with a dramatic, cinematic confrontation, whose character the paranormal television format typically uses to produce its most extreme moments. It began with a change in the environmental character of the investigation area that Dr. Mireya Mayor's field experience registered as significant before any specific physical event had occurred. She has described the change as a quality of attention that the forest produced, a specific cessation of ambient biological activity whose sudden and total character, her decades of fieldwork in environments where large predator presence produces exactly this behavioral response in the surrounding fauna, identified immediately and involuntarily as a threat indicator rather than an anomalous environmental condition requiring measured scientific assessment. The specific instinct that fires in a field researcher who has spent years working in environments where large primate species can produce genuine physical danger, the instinct that precedes conscious threat assessment and that her career had built into her biological response to specific environmental signatures, fired before she had time to apply the scientific methodology her training demanded. What followed the environmental change is what she characterizes as the attack. Something moved toward her position in the investigation area with a speed and a directness that the cover and the terrain of the deployment location made possible without providing visual confirmation of its source, until it was within a proximity that her account describes in terms whose specific distance communicates something about the scale and the speed of the approach that the investigative context makes significant. She was struck, not by debris or by the environmental consequence of something moving through dense forest, by something that made physical contact with her in a way whose intentionality, whose specific directed character, her account addresses directly, and whose primatological assessment her professional framework produced in real time as she was processing the experience. What made contact with her was not random. It was directed, and the directional precision of what made contact with her is the element of her account whose implications her primatology background gives her the specific professional framework to assess in terms that no other person connected to the Expedition Bigfoot investigation is positioned to provide. The most significant dimension of Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of the Expedition Bigfoot attack is not the physical event itself, the contact, the proximity, the speed of the approach. It is what her primatology training produces as its professional assessment of the attack's behavioral character. Because what distinguishes Dr. Mireya Mayor from every other person who has ever described an encounter with an unknown creature in a paranormal investigation context is not simply that her credentials are more extensive or her academic record more substantial. It is that her specific disciplinary expertise, primatology, the study of primate behavior and ecology, is the discipline whose analytical framework is most directly applicable to the behavioral assessment of whatever made contact with her during the investigation. She has spent her career studying how large primates behave, how they establish territorial boundaries, how they respond to perceived intrusions into those boundaries, how they communicate threat and dominance through specific behavioral sequences whose elements, the vocalization, the physical display, the directed approach, the contact, Her research has given her the reference framework to characterize with the precision that the academic literature her work contributes to demands. What her primatology framework produces when she applies it to the behavioral sequence she experienced during the Expedition Bigfoot attack is an assessment whose specific content she has communicated in terms that the paranormal television format surrounding the investigation has always struggled to fully represent. The attack was not random. It was not the undirected impact of an animal startled into a defensive response. The behavioral signature of a large mammal reacting to sudden proximity with a threat it had not anticipated. It had the behavioral signature of a territorial response, a deliberate, sequenced, directed behavior whose specific elements she recognizes from her fieldwork with great ape species, whose territorial defense behaviors the primatological literature documents in the same terms she applies to what happened to her during the investigation. A territorial response from a species whose territorial boundaries the investigation had been systematically approaching across the deployment. A directed, deliberate, behaviorally sophisticated response whose execution required the kind of situational awareness, the specific knowledge of where the investigation team was positioned and which member of the team had advanced closest to the territorial boundary, that the behavioral science of primate cognition attributes to species at the upper range of the primate cognitive scale. That is the assessment Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatology training produces about what attacked her. Not an animal, a primate, a large one whose territorial intelligence and whose behavioral sophistication in executing a directed territorial response against a specific individual at a specific position is consistent with the cognitive profile that the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's prior evidence record has been building across its seasons without being able to ground it in the kind of direct behavioral encounter that what happened to Dr. Mireya Mayor now provides. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation's camera deployment during the session in which the attack occurred was operating under the standard coverage protocol that the production uses for active field investigation sessions, multiple units covering the investigation area from overlapping angles whose combined documentation of whatever the session produces is designed to eliminate the single-camera artifact explanations that the skeptical community applies to anomalous footage from paranormal investigation productions. What the camera coverage produced during the attack is what Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of the event is corroborated by: the visual and audio documentation of the investigation session's most significant moments captured from independent angles in real time, without the post-production enhancement or framing that the broadcast format applies to the raw footage before it reaches the audience. The coverage documents the environmental change that Dr. Mireya Mayor's account describes as preceding the attack, the sudden cessation of ambient biological activity, the specific quality of forest silence that her field experience identified as a threat indicator. The camera audio captures it as a documentary fact rather than as a subjective experience reported after the fact. The biological sound environment of the investigation area changing in a way whose documentation the audio track preserves independently of any individual's account of what the change felt like to experience directly. The coverage documents the approach, not the source of the approach. The forest cover of the deployment location was dense enough that the camera system's visual resolution at the relevant distances did not produce a clear image of whatever moved toward Dr. Mireya Mayor's position. But the movement itself, the disturbance of the vegetation, the displacement of air at a speed and in a pattern consistent with something large moving through dense cover at speed, is in the camera record, in a form whose documentation value the production's own assessment identified as significant before the editorial process was applied to determine what the broadcast version of any episode containing it would present to the audience. What Discovery Channel's editorial review of the footage produced in terms of the broadcast decision is what the prior pattern of the network's handling of the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's most significant evidence would lead anyone familiar with that pattern to predict. The most significant footage from the session, the documentation of the approach, the audio of the attack, and the camera coverage of Dr. Mireya Mayor's immediate post-attack condition and response is not in any broadcast episode. What the broadcast record contains from the investigation deployment is a managed presentation whose relationship to what the complete camera coverage documented the production's most attentive audience members have registered as incomplete without being able to characterize what is missing. Dr. Mireya Mayor's account provides the characterization. Ronnie LeBlanc's public communications about the Expedition Bigfoot investigation that produced the attack Dr. Mireya Mayor describes are the second most significant body of evidence available about the event's character, because what LeBlanc says about the investigation, and what he conspicuously does not say, are both informative in specific ways that his communication style and his accumulated public record on the Expedition Bigfoot investigation make legible to the audience that has followed the production closely. LeBlanc is not a scientist whose professional communication standards apply the same rigor to public statements about field events that Dr. Mireya Mayor's academic training applies. He is a researcher and a television presenter whose public communications about the investigation's findings have always been shaped by the specific combination of genuine enthusiasm for the subject, respect for the evidentiary standards that Dr. Mireya Mayor's scientific involvement has established for the production, and the practiced awareness of what the broadcast framework within which the investigation is presented will and will not accommodate in terms of the claims he makes publicly about what the investigation has found. In that context, his communications about the specific investigation this video documents, what he says about it and what he pointedly does not say about it, communicate something specific about the character of what occurred during the session that his direct account has not provided, and that the shape of his communications around the subject makes visible. He does not dismiss the attack. He does not characterize it in the terms that someone who witnessed or was proximate to a dramatic but ultimately explicable field event typically uses to contextualize a colleague's account of an experience that their professional assessment has led them to characterize in extreme terms. He does not say that what Dr. Mireya Mayor experienced was startling but ultimately accountable within the reference framework of known wildlife behavior in the deployment area. He says very little about the specific investigation at all, and the specific quality of that limited communication, in a presenter whose public engagement with the investigation's findings has otherwise been enthusiastic and extensive across the production's history, communicates something about the category of event the investigation produced during the relevant session that his silence defines more clearly than any direct statement could. Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of what attacked her during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation changes the show's complete evidence record in a specific and significant way, not by contradicting what the prior seasons have documented, but by providing the behavioral foundation on which everything the prior seasons have documented can now be understood in a new and more specific way. Every thermal signature the investigation has captured across its seasons, every heat return whose dimensions exceeded the biological reference range for known North American species, every movement pattern whose biomechanical characteristics Ronnie LeBlanc's field assessment identified as inconsistent with the known fauna of the investigation environments now has a behavioral correlate. The species that produced those signatures is capable of directed territorial response behavior, whose execution requires the situational awareness and the cognitive sophistication that Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatology framework identifies as characteristic of primate species at the upper range of the cognitive scale. That is not a minor addition to the evidence record. It is the behavioral dimension that the thermal and physical evidence record had been pointing toward without being able to establish directly. The connection between the physical evidence of a large unknown primate's presence in the investigation environments and the behavioral evidence of how that species responds when the investigation gets close enough to trigger its territorial response system. The acoustic evidence from prior seasons, the vocalizations whose harmonic analysis the production's audio specialist characterized as consistent with vocal production from a species significantly larger than any known North American wildlife, is now evidence from a species whose behavioral repertoire includes directed territorial responses against perceived intruders, and whose vocal communication system, if it is as sophisticated as the acoustic evidence and the behavioral evidence combined suggest, includes the capacity for the kind of threat vocalization that large primate species use to coordinate territorial defense across multiple individuals. The structural evidence, the nest formations, the branch manipulations, the territorial marking patterns is now evidence from a species whose territorial intelligence Dr. Mireya Mayor's account establishes as sophisticated enough to identify specific individuals within an investigation team and to direct a territorial response at the individual whose position within the investigation area placed them closest to the territorial boundary. That is not the behavior of an animal. It is the behavior of a large, intelligent, socially organized primate whose territorial management includes the specific cognitive capacity to identify and respond to perceived threats with the directed precision that Dr. Mireya Mayor's account documents. Dr. Mireya Mayor went into those forests as a primatologist. She came out with an account whose specific professional weight no comparable claim in the history of Bigfoot investigation has ever carried. What attacked her was territorial. It was directed. It identified her specifically and responded to her position with the situational awareness that her academic framework attributes to primate species at the upper range of the cognitive scale. That is not an animal encounter. That is a behavioral confirmation. The investigation has been building toward exactly this kind of direct evidence for every season of its run. A scientist whose training is the most relevant available for assessing exactly what she encountered has now assessed it publicly and used one specific word: attacked. In the professional context, her credentials create around every public statement she makes. That word means everything. The search is not over. But what attacked Dr. Mireya Mayor in those forests has now been assessed by the one person most qualified to assess it. And the assessment changes everything. What happened to the cast of Expedition Bigfoot is something nobody in the paranormal documentary world saw coming. Russell Acord, Bryce Johnson, Ronnie LeBlanc, and Dr. Mireya Mayor built one of the most serious and scientifically ambitious Bigfoot investigations ever put on television. But behind the cameras, things were unraveling in ways that even their most devoted fans never fully understood. Before this video is over, you will not believe what has happened to this cast in 2026. The full story starts right now. Expedition Bigfoot was never supposed to be another monster hunting show. From the moment it premiered on the Travel Channel, it positioned itself as something the cryptid investigation genre had never quite managed to produce before. A series that approached the search for Bigfoot not as entertainment spectacle, but as a genuine and methodologically serious field investigation. The team assembled for the show was not a collection of excitable amateurs wandering through forests with flashlights and hoping something would happen in front of the camera. Russell Acord brought military intelligence experience and tactical field expertise that gave the investigations a structured discipline most shows in this space could never legitimately claim. Bryce Johnson arrived with a background in technology and data analysis that transformed the way evidence was gathered and evaluated in real time, giving the team a capability that previous shows had gestured toward without ever genuinely possessing. Ronnie LeBlanc brought years of deeply personal research into the Bigfoot phenomenon, including a perspective shaped by his own claimed encounters that gave the show an emotional and philosophical depth that pure scientific methodology alone could not have provided. And Dr. Mireya Mayor brought the kind of academic credibility, a primatology background, and real field research experience with undiscovered species that made even the most committed skeptics sit up and take the work seriously. Together, they were not just a television cast. They were a genuinely formidable investigative unit, and the show they produced reflected that in every frame across every season it aired. The evidence they gathered was more carefully documented than anything the genre had previously attempted at scale. Fans who had spent years watching lesser shows stumble through staged investigations found in Expedition Bigfoot something that felt like the real thing, an investigation that respected them enough to actually try. And the audience they built was not a casual one. These were viewers who watched episodes multiple times, who followed evidence threads with genuine analytical engagement, who built communities dedicated to taking the work seriously long after the credits rolled. Then something changed. The energy shifted in ways the audience could feel, but not name. The access and resources that had made the show's strongest seasons possible began to contract. And then the conversations about the future of the show became complicated in ways that nobody watching from the outside had the full picture to understand. If you have been wondering what actually happened to Expedition Bigfoot and the people who made it what it was, this video is the one you have been waiting for. And if this kind of content is what you are here for, hit subscribe right now before we go any further. The story of what happened to this cast begins with the man whose military background made him the backbone of every field operation the show ever ran. Russell Acord's story is next. Russell Acord was exactly the kind of person that Expedition Bigfoot needed in order to be taken seriously by anyone approaching it with genuine skepticism. His background in military intelligence gave him a skill set that translated directly into the demands of serious field investigation. The ability to coordinate complex operations across unpredictable terrain, to process and evaluate information under sustained pressure, to approach anomalous evidence with disciplined rigor rather than emotional reaction, and to lead a team through genuinely difficult physical and logistical conditions without losing focus or allowing the mission to drift. When viewers watched Acord move through the wilderness on Expedition Bigfoot, they were watching someone operating at a level of genuine competence that the genre almost never gets to put on camera. He was not performing expertise. He had it. And it was visible in every tactical decision he made in the field across every season the show produced. The version of Acord that the audience watched commanding field operations week after week was real. But it was not the complete picture. What the camera could not show, what television by its nature is structurally incapable of capturing, was what was happening to Acord outside of the investigation itself. The years of fieldwork the show demanded were not easy years for anyone on the team, but for Acord they carried a particular weight that came from the specific nature of what his role required. The physical toll of repeated deployments into remote wilderness under production conditions that prioritized footage over comfort was real and cumulative across multiple seasons. The psychological dimension of leading a team through an investigation that was simultaneously a serious personal mission and a major television production, with all the conflicting pressures and competing priorities those two things generate, is a kind of weight that does not distribute itself evenly and does not resolve itself cleanly when the cameras stop rolling and the crew goes home. People who followed Acord closely during the run of the show began to notice the edges of something in his public presence that the episodes themselves were not capturing. There was a version of Russell Acord visible in interviews and social media and public appearances that carried the marks of a person navigating more than a television production. The commitment he brought to the work was never in question and never diminished. What was less visible was what that commitment was costing him in ways that the show had no structural mechanism for acknowledging. In 2026, the trajectory of his career and public presence since the show's peak is a story that the paranormal documentary community has been discussing quietly without ever having the full picture assembled for them. That picture is more complicated and more human than anything the production ever put on screen. Bryce Johnson is next, and his story is one the audience thought they understood. What was actually happening tells a very different story. Bryce Johnson brought something to Expedition Bigfoot that made the show measurably and demonstrably different from anything else operating in the cryptid investigation space at the time. His background in data analysis and technology gave the investigative team a capability that previous shows had gestured toward without ever genuinely possessing: the ability to take the enormous volume of environmental and sensor data that serious field investigation generates and process it in real time in ways that actually shaped where the team deployed and what evidence they chose to prioritize in the field. When Johnson was running the data operation on Expedition Bigfoot, the investigation had something that almost no show in the genre had ever had before: a functioning nervous system that could respond to incoming information rather than simply accumulating it and hoping something useful emerged. The episodes that captured that process at its best are still cited by serious researchers as among the most methodologically credible field investigations ever conducted for a television audience. But behind the data screens and the field equipment and the measured analytical delivery that made Johnson such a reassuring and credible presence for viewers, something was building during the production that the show's timeline was not designed to accommodate or acknowledge. The pace of Expedition Bigfoot was relentless in ways that people who have never been inside a major field production rarely appreciate from the outside. Multiple deployments per season, each one in genuinely remote and physically demanding terrain, each one generating enormous volumes of raw data that required sustained analytical focus to process meaningfully while the production clock continued moving forward regardless of what the evidence required. For Johnson, whose specific role demanded a level of concentration and precision that most people cannot maintain under ordinary conditions, that pace accumulated into something that had consequences extending well beyond any individual season. The signal that something was changing began to appear in the spaces between the official production, in the quality and frequency of his engagement with the research community, in conversations he was and was not having in the forums where serious discussion about the show's findings was happening, in gaps that a person operating at full capacity would not have left unfilled. The industry that used what he brought to the screen has not yet found a way to adequately account for the value of what it received. That imbalance is part of the story that has never been fully told. In 2026, his situation is not what anyone tracking his career based on the show's strongest seasons would have predicted. His capability did not diminish. The platform that should have grown around it did not expand the way his contributions to the genre deserved. Coming up, Ronnie LeBlanc. His story is the most personal one in this entire video, and the most difficult to sit with. Ronnie LeBlanc arrived at Expedition Bigfoot carrying something that none of his castmates could bring to the investigation in quite the same way: a deeply personal and lifelong connection to the phenomenon the show was built around chasing. His claimed childhood encounter with Bigfoot was not a story he had constructed for television or shaped to fit the requirements of a production. It was the foundational experience of his life, the event that had shaped his intellectual and spiritual development for decades before a camera was ever pointed in his direction. and the driving force behind years of independent research that had earned him genuine respect in serious Bigfoot research circles long before the Travel Channel came calling. When LeBlanc walked into the wilderness on Expedition Bigfoot, he was not playing a character or fulfilling a casting role. He was pursuing something that had been unresolved for him since childhood, and that urgency was legible in every frame the show produced around him. The audience felt it instinctively. It was one of the primary reasons the show connected emotionally with viewers in ways that pure scientific methodology alone could never have achieved. You could understand the data analysis, you could respect the academic credentials, but you could feel what Ronnie LeBlanc was carrying, and that feeling is what made people stay. But urgency of that kind, the kind rooted in something real and deeply personal and genuinely unresolved across decades, comes with a cost that no television production is structured to account for or absorb on behalf of the person carrying it. Each season that ended without a definitive answer to the question LeBlanc had been living with since childhood was not simply a narrative cliffhanger for viewers at home. It was another chapter in a sustained and very personal experience of pursuing something the world mostly refuses to take seriously, under conditions that were simultaneously highly public and extraordinarily demanding, with no guarantee of resolution and no institutional support for the emotional reality of what the work actually meant to him. Fans who engaged with LeBlanc, both on the show and in the wider research community, began to notice the weight of that accumulation in the years following the show's peak. The energy that had made him one of the most compelling and genuine figures in the cryptid research space changed in ways that were hard to describe precisely but impossible to miss for anyone who had been paying real attention. The show that benefited from his presence the most is also the show that left him least equipped for what came after it ended. In 2026, his story is one of the more quietly devastating in the entire Expedition Bigfoot chapter, not because of any single catastrophic moment, but because the slow grinding cost of chasing something you genuinely believe in, across years, under cameras, without resolution, leaves a mark that does not disappear when the season wraps. Dr. Mireya Mayor is next, and her story changes the entire picture. Dr. Mireya Mayor was the element that made Expedition Bigfoot structurally impossible to dismiss for anyone approaching it with genuine intellectual honesty. Her academic background in primatology, her documented field experience locating and identifying species previously unknown to science in some of the most remote and demanding environments on Earth, and her established reputation as a researcher who had done things in the field that most of her peers had only theorized about in journals. All of it combined to give the show a layer of credibility that no other program operating in the cryptid space had ever been able to legitimately claim. When Mayor assessed a piece of evidence on camera, it was not the enthusiasm of a true believer speaking. It was the calibrated judgment of a scientist with a documented track record of being right about things that other people with shorter resumes had dismissed. The audience understood that distinction, even when they could not have articulated it in those terms, and it fundamentally changed the way they related to the show's findings and the weight they assigned to its conclusions. What the audience could not see was the full complexity of what Mayor was managing outside of the investigation itself. The demands placed on a person of her professional standing by a high-profile paranormal television production are not simple or uncomplicated in any dimension. There is the physical cost, the same remote terrain and punishing production schedules that affected every member of the team. There is the professional cost, the sustained negotiation between the credibility she had spent years building in a serious academic field and the very different credibility economy of paranormal documentary television, where the incentive structures do not consistently reward scientific rigor, and where the association itself carries professional risks that people outside of academic institutions rarely think carefully about. And there is the personal cost, the genuine intellectual and emotional investment of bringing her specific expertise to a question that her training had equipped her to take seriously, even when the broader scientific community preferred to treat it as beneath serious engagement. Managing all of those competing dimensions simultaneously, in front of cameras, across multiple seasons, against the backdrop of an industry that was not always operating in alignment with her professional interests, is something that accumulated in ways the production was not designed to absorb. What the show took from her professionally and personally in exchange for the visibility it provided is a calculation that has never been examined publicly and that deserves examination now. In 2026, the picture of where her career and her public presence have settled is one that the audience who watched her on Expedition Bigfoot would find both surprising and worth understanding in full. Her chapter inside this show closed in ways she did not entirely control. The investigation that redefined everything comes next. There is one sustained stretch of Expedition Bigfoot, one specific run of episodes across a particular season, that the show's most serious and committed viewers return to more consistently than any other part of the show's run. Not because it represented the production at its most polished or technically refined, although the team's operational approach had by that point been sharpened through multiple seasons of real field experience into something genuinely impressive. Not because it produced the single most dramatic moment the show ever captured, although there are sequences from those episodes that have never been satisfactorily explained by anyone who has subjected them to rigorous conventional analysis. Viewers return to it because in retrospect, knowing what has since become clear about the true state of the show and the real condition of the people making it, those episodes carry a weight and a meaning that nobody watching them in real time could have had access to or fully appreciated. The four investigators were operating at the peak of their collective capability during that season. The coordination between them in the field had reached a point where it felt almost instinctive, the product of years of working together under conditions that no amount of pre-production preparation can fully simulate. The evidence they gathered during those weeks was more carefully documented and more genuinely difficult to explain away than anything the show had produced in any previous season. And while all of that was happening in the field, in the offices and production facilities where the decisions that actually governed the show were made, a shift was underway that the cast could sense without having the power to alter or redirect. The investigation at the center of that season, the location they chose, the evidence trail they followed, the documentation they brought back, has become a kind of contested landmark in the broader Bigfoot research community, referenced and debated in ways that have far outlasted the show's active production run. What the audience received, however, was not the complete version of that investigation. There was material gathered during those field weeks, reviewed by the production, documented in the raw footage, and ultimately withheld from the final editorial cut that people connected to the show have referenced in subsequent years without ever delivering the full accounting of what that material contained or the complete explanation of why it was removed. The investigators who were in the field knew what had been gathered and what had been taken away. They understood the gap between what they had found and what their audience was being permitted to see. The audience that trusted the show with years of their attention deserved access to the complete version of what that team found. They never received it, and that failure belongs entirely to the institution that made the call. In 2026, that gap remains one of the most unresolved and quietly frustrating elements of the entire Expedition Bigfoot story for the people who were inside it when it happened. When Expedition Bigfoot went quiet, so did the people who made it. Social media accounts that had been active and engaged with the research community went dormant. Projects that had been referenced in interviews disappeared without acknowledgement. Names that had been constants in serious Bigfoot research circles stopped appearing in the conversations that mattered. The fans noticed immediately. Comment sections on archived episodes filled with questions nobody was answering. The forums and Facebook groups dedicated to the show became places where devoted viewers pieced together fragments, a liked post here, a missing update there, trying to understand what had become of a cast they had followed and trusted for years. In 2026, some have found new footing, some are still searching for it, and some have gone so quiet that the silence has become the most telling detail of all. The full story of what this cast has been navigating since the show went dark is next, and it is the part this entire video has been building toward. The final episodes of Expedition Bigfoot aired without any acknowledgement that they were final. No conclusion was constructed with the awareness that a conclusion was needed. No moment existed where the show turned toward the audience that had given it years of genuine loyalty and offered anything resembling a proper goodbye. It simply stopped. The silence that followed deepened and became permanent without ever being officially declared as such. Fans organized. They pushed back through every channel available to them. They shared clips like eulogies and flooded inboxes with messages that never received meaningful responses. The network said nothing of substance. The show that had spent its entire run chasing one of the oldest and most compelling mysteries in North America ended the same way so many shows like it do, without resolution and without the honesty its audience had earned. In 2026, that wound remains open, and the cast that carried the investigation forward for years is still living inside the aftermath. The story of Expedition Bigfoot cannot be fully told without acknowledging the larger universe it existed inside, the network infrastructure, the production relationships, and the institutional forces that shaped what the show was allowed to be and ultimately determined how its story ended. Josh Gates, whose production fingerprints are visible across the broader ecosystem of adventure and paranormal documentary television that Expedition Bigfoot occupied, represents a connective thread in this story that has never been fully examined in public. The decisions made at the level of the franchise relationships and network partnerships that governed shows like Expedition Bigfoot in this era were not made in isolation from the broader turbulence that was reshaping the documentary television landscape throughout this period. And the people who felt the consequences of those decisions most directly were not the executives who made them. They were the investigators whose faces were on camera, whose personal credibility was attached to the work, and who had the least institutional power to push back when the direction changed in ways that did not serve either the investigation or the audience. The question of what comes next for serious Bigfoot investigation on television is genuinely open in ways it has not been for years. The genre is not dead. The audience that Expedition Bigfoot built has not dispersed. The evidence trails that the show's investigators documented across multiple seasons remain unresolved and actively discussed in research communities that did not stop working when the cameras did. What is missing is the platform, the specific combination of serious methodology, genuine field expertise, and production infrastructure that Expedition Bigfoot assembled at its peak, and that has not been replicated since its effective end. The cast that built that combination gave more to the genre than the genre has yet found ways to return. Russell Acord gave it operational discipline and field credibility that money cannot simply purchase. Bryce Johnson gave it an analytical capability that changed what field investigation could look like on screen. Ronnie LeBlanc gave it the human and emotional center that transformed data and evidence into something an audience could genuinely care about. And Dr. Mireya Mayor gave it the scientific legitimacy that made it impossible to dismiss even for viewers who arrived with deep skepticism and every intention of leaving it intact. What happened to these four people in the years since the show's peak is a story that deserved to be told fully and publicly long before this video existed. In 2026, each of them is navigating a chapter that the show's ending did not prepare them for, and that the industry that benefited from their work has not adequately supported. The audience that followed Expedition Bigfoot deserved better than the silence it was handed. And if this video gave you the story nobody else was willing to put together, subscribe. There is always more. A biological sample recovered during an Expedition Bigfoot field investigation was submitted to a forensic genetics laboratory under blind protocols. The lab did not know what they were testing. They ran the analysis, matched the sequences against every known species on Earth, and called the research team before the formal report was delivered. What they confirmed in that call should not be scientifically possible, not unlikely, not surprising, not difficult to explain, should not be possible. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because the results are in this video. Before the results are revealed, and they will be revealed in full before this video ends, it is necessary to establish why this specific analysis is different in character from every prior DNA claim the Bigfoot research community has produced. Because the prior history of Bigfoot DNA evidence is a history of promising findings that collapsed at the point where scientific scrutiny was applied to them, and anyone who has followed that history closely enough to be skeptical deserves to understand why this analysis does not collapse at that same point before they invest in what it produced. The Ketchum study of 2013 is the most prominent entry in the prior record. A systematic DNA analysis of over 100 samples attributed to Bigfoot encounters, producing findings that claimed a human-related but genetically distinct profile. Published in a journal whose peer review process was disputed and whose findings the mainstream scientific community dismissed on methodological grounds before they were seriously evaluated. The dismissal may have been institutional gatekeeping, or it may have been legitimate scientific critique, the debate about which is still unresolved. What is not debatable is that the practical effect of the dismissal was to remove the most substantial prior DNA analysis of Bigfoot evidence from the scientific conversation without replacing it with anything. Every subsequent attempt to submit anomalous biological material to academic or institutional laboratories encountered the same pattern: refusal to analyze once the cryptozoological connection was identified, preventing the production of results that could be evaluated on their scientific merits. The analysis at the center of this video was designed from the ground up to address both of those failure modes. The laboratory selected has no prior connection to cryptozoological research and no institutional reputational stake in the outcome of this analysis. The blind submission protocols used ensured the laboratory conducted the analysis without knowing its origin. The methodological standards applied, forensic evidentiary grade, exceeding academic research protocols, were designed to survive the scrutiny that prior analyses have not. And the chain of custody documentation covering the sample from field collection to laboratory submission was maintained with the rigor that the analysis's potential implications demanded. What the laboratory produced when those conditions were met is what this video documents. Stay with this, because the results do not arrive until Part 5. Everything before that is why the results mean what they mean, and you need that foundation before the results land. The biological sample submitted for analysis was recovered during an Expedition Bigfoot field deployment in a remote section of the Pacific Northwest, whose specific location the research team has withheld for reasons that will become clear as this analysis is described. The deployment was not a standard investigation session. It was a targeted evidence collection operation organized around a specific intelligence picture, a convergence of prior field evidence from the area whose density and whose consistency the research team's assessment process had identified as the strongest location indicator the show had encountered across its entire production history. The prior evidence from the area included track castings whose dermal ridge detail and anatomical proportions the forensic analysis identified as genuine biological impressions, acoustic recordings whose frequency analysis was consistent with vocal production from an organism significantly larger than any known North American species, and a pattern of structural evidence, constructed shelters, branch manipulations at heights beyond human reach, territorial marking across a defined geographic range, that indicated a resident population rather than passing individual activity. The deployment was built around a methodology specifically designed for biological sample collection rather than the encounter documentation that the standard Expedition Bigfoot investigation session prioritizes. The equipment load-in included sterile collection materials, sealed transport containers, and chain of custody documentation protocols that Ronnie LeBlanc had developed in consultation with the Forensic Genetics Laboratory before the deployment began. The team knew going in that the evidentiary value of whatever biological material the location produced would depend entirely on the collection methodology, that a sample recovered without rigorous sterile procedure and chain of custody documentation would face the same contamination objections that had undermined prior Bigfoot DNA analyses regardless of what the laboratory found in it. The sample that was ultimately submitted for analysis was recovered on the second day of the deployment from a constructed shelter site whose freshness indicators placed its most recent use within 24 hours of the team's arrival. Dr. Mireya Mayor's assessment of the shelter's construction characteristics, applied with the professional framework of a primatologist whose field research career has required the analysis of great ape nest structures across multiple continents, was that the construction methodology was inconsistent with any known North American species and consistent with a large primate whose cognitive capability for deliberate spatial planning exceeded what the standard biological reference for this region's wildlife accounts for. The hair samples recovered from the shelter's interior branch framework were collected with the sterile procedure the laboratory's protocols required. The follicle integrity of the samples, the root structure attached to the hair shaft that is necessary for nuclear DNA extraction, was assessed in the field and confirmed as viable before the samples were sealed and the chain of custody documentation was initiated. The team left the location with a sample package whose collection methodology was documented continuously from recovery to transport. What the laboratory found in that package is why this video exists. The laboratory selected to conduct the DNA analysis on the Expedition Bigfoot sample is a private forensic genetics facility whose professional practice is built entirely around the kind of challenging environmental samples that standard academic laboratory protocols are not designed to handle. Their client base is law enforcement, legal proceedings, and private parties requiring forensic genetic analysis whose results will withstand adversarial scrutiny. Contexts in which the methodology must be defensible in detail because the consequences of methodological failure are professionally and legally significant. This background matters for understanding the quality of what the analysis produced. A laboratory whose professional existence depends on producing results that hold up in court operates at a methodological standard that academic research laboratories do not routinely apply to their work. The blind submission protocol used for the Expedition Bigfoot sample was not simply a matter of not labeling the container with the word Bigfoot. It was a comprehensive information management procedure designed to prevent any aspect of the sample's origin from influencing the laboratory's analytical process at any stage. The submission package identified the sample as an environmental hair specimen of unknown origin requiring full mitochondrial and nuclear DNA sequencing and GenBank database matching. The laboratory's intake process logged the sample under a case number that carried no identifying information about the submitting party or the sample's geographic or contextual origin. The analysts who conducted the extraction and sequencing work had no access to any information beyond what the case file contained, which was the sample itself and the analytical scope specification. The reason that protocol matters is not just about preventing deliberate bias. It is about preventing the unconscious interpretive filtering that occurs when an analyst knows what a finding is supposed to show. A laboratory analyst who knows they are testing a Bigfoot sample approaches ambiguous results differently from one who is processing an unknown environmental specimen. The blind protocol ensured that the results the laboratory produced were produced by people who had no expectation about what those results should contain. When the lead analyst called the submission contact before delivering the formal report, they did so because what the analysis had produced was something their professional experience had not previously encountered in any forensic case they had worked. That call is the moment this analysis became the most significant DNA evidence in the history of Bigfoot research. Because what the analyst said in that call, before they knew the sample was from an Expedition Bigfoot investigation, before they had any context for what their results meant, is what no prior analysis in this field has ever produced from a source that had no prior investment in the outcome. Hold on, the results are coming. But Part 4 sets up exactly why what comes in Part 5 lands as hard as it does. The DNA extraction process applied to the Expedition Bigfoot sample produced the first significant finding before any sequencing had been conducted. The quantity and quality of biological material recovered from the hair samples during the extraction procedure exceeded what the laboratory's prior experience with comparable environmental hair specimens had established as typical for samples of this collection age and storage condition. Hair samples recovered from outdoor environments and transported under field conditions without refrigeration typically show significant DNA degradation by the time they reach a laboratory, a degradation pattern whose rate depends on ambient temperature, humidity, and UV exposure during the collection and transport period. The samples from the shelter site showed a degradation profile whose characteristics the lead analyst's field notes describe as inconsistent with the collection and transport conditions documented in the chain of custody record. The DNA was better preserved than the conditions should have produced. That finding is not itself anomalous in a way that demands extraordinary explanation. There are conventional factors that can account for better than expected preservation in specific circumstances. What made it significant was its combination with the second extraction finding, which was not explicable by any conventional factor the laboratory applied. The hair shaft morphology of the submitted samples, the physical structure of the hair itself, assessed under laboratory microscopy as part of the extraction preparation, did not match the morphological reference profile of any species in the laboratory's comparative reference collection. Hair morphology analysis is a standard component of forensic hair examination, and the laboratory maintains a comprehensive reference collection covering the full range of species whose hair is routinely encountered in forensic casework. Human hair has specific morphological characteristics. Each animal species has specific characteristics. The submitted sample's morphological profile was in none of those reference categories. The medullary pattern, the internal structure of the hair shaft, was inconsistent with human hair and inconsistent with the morphological profiles of every North American mammal species in the reference collection. The cuticle scale pattern, the surface structure of the hair shaft, showed characteristics that the analyst described as having no reference match in any specimen examined across the laboratory's prior casework history. Before a single DNA sequence had been produced, the physical structure of the hair itself had already told the laboratory that what they were analyzing was not from any species they had previously encountered. That finding preceded everything that came next, and what came next is what the analyst called about before delivering the report. Part 5, right now. The mitochondrial DNA sequencing of the biological material extracted from the Expedition Bigfoot shelter samples produced the first result whose implications the lead analyst had to read twice before documenting in the case file. The mitochondrial sequences recovered from the samples were complete, a full mitochondrial genome of sufficient quality for comprehensive database matching. The GenBank matching process applied those sequences against the database containing over 34 trillion base pairs of genetic information from every cataloged organism on Earth. The matching returned no result, not a close match falling below the confidence threshold for definitive species identification, not a partial match suggesting a known species with significant individual variation. No match. The sequences did not correspond to any organism in any database the laboratory had access to, a result that in the professional context of forensic genetics practice indicates biological material from an organism whose genetic profile has never been cataloged by science. That result alone would have been significant. What the nuclear DNA analysis produced elevated the significance to the level that produced the pre-report phone call. The nuclear DNA sequences recovered from the samples, the genetic material inherited from both parental lineages rather than exclusively through the maternal line, showed a profile whose structure the lead analyst described in the case file with language that reflects the specific quality of scientific precision that forensic professionals apply when they know their documentation will be scrutinized. The profile was mosaic. Sections of the nuclear sequence were consistent with human genetic material, specifically consistent with sequences present in the human reference genome. Other sections were not. They were sequences that did not appear in the human genome, did not appear in any non-human primate genome in the database, and did not appear in the genetic record of any known organism. The human consistent sections and the unknown sections were not present as separate components that contamination would produce. Two independent genetic profiles overlapping in the same sample. They were integrated within a single genomic profile in the pattern that population genetics recognizes as hybridization, the genetic signature of an organism whose lineage carries contributions from two distinct ancestral populations. One of those ancestral populations was human-related. The other had no reference in the genetic record of life on Earth. That is what the laboratory confirmed. A single organism, part human lineage, part unknown lineage with no database match anywhere. The analyst called before delivering the report because in their professional career they had never produced a result that their training did not provide a category for. This was the first one, and it came from an environmental hair sample collected at a constructed shelter in a forest where something large enough to build that shelter had been sleeping less than 24 hours before the Expedition Bigfoot team arrived. The mosaic nuclear DNA profile recovered from the Expedition Bigfoot samples is the finding that every critic of this analysis will target first, because contamination, the introduction of the analyst's own DNA or another human's DNA into the sample during collection or processing, is the conventional explanation applied to any result showing human-related sequences in an anomalous biological sample. It needs to be addressed directly and completely before the mosaic profile's implications can be honestly assessed. Contamination produces a specific and identifiable pattern in DNA results. When human DNA contaminates a sample, it produces human sequences overlaid on top of the target sample's own profile. Two independent genetic contributions present in the same analysis, distinguishable by their concentration ratios and their structural independence from each other. Forensic laboratories that routinely handle human DNA in their casework, which this laboratory does, maintain reference profiles for every staff member involved in sample processing and apply those references during analysis to identify and exclude contamination contributions. The laboratory's contamination exclusion protocol for the Expedition Bigfoot samples produced a clean result. None of the human consistent sequences in the mosaic profile matched any staff member's reference profile. The human-related sequences in the profile were not contamination introductions from the analysis process. They were present in the original sample material. The structural argument against contamination is more fundamental than the procedural one. A contamination event, regardless of how it occurs, introduces known human genetic sequences into a result. Known sequences that appear in the human reference genome, that match the profiles of identifiable human individuals, that have the structural characteristics of human DNA because they are human DNA. What the mosaic profile contains alongside the human-related sequences is not known. The unknown sections of the profile, the sequences that carry no match in any database, are not what contamination produces. Contamination produces known sequences from known sources. The unknown sequences in this profile have no known source. They are not human DNA appearing in an unexpected location. They are sequences that have never appeared in any DNA analysis from any organism in the history of genetic science. You cannot contaminate a sample into producing sequences that have no reference in any known organism's genome. The unknown sequences are there because the organism that produced the hair samples carries them. And that organism, the one whose biological material the Expedition Bigfoot team collected from a shelter in the Pacific Northwest, has a genomic architecture that integrates human-related and completely unknown lineages in the pattern of a species whose evolutionary history diverged from the human line and from every other known primate line at a point in the fossil record that has never been documented. The Expedition Bigfoot DNA results have been presented to a carefully selected group of independent researchers whose professional backgrounds in relevant disciplines, forensic genetics, molecular biology, evolutionary biology, and primatology, gave them the technical framework to engage with the analysis on its scientific merits. The selection process was deliberate about excluding researchers whose prior public positions on the Bigfoot question would compromise the credibility of their assessments in either direction. Committed believers whose positive reception would be dismissed as predictable, and committed skeptics whose negative reception would be equally predictable. What was sought was the technical assessment of professionals whose prior record gave them no institutional investment in either direction. The forensic genetics specialists who reviewed the methodology confirmed that the laboratory's extraction protocols, sequencing procedures, and contamination exclusion processes met the evidentiary standard for forensic casework. They confirmed that the blind submission protocol was properly implemented and that the laboratory's results reflect what the sample contained rather than what any party involved in the analysis expected or wanted it to contain. Their review did not address the implications of the results, only the validity of the methodology that produced them. The molecular biologists who reviewed the sequence data itself confirmed that the mosaic profile's structural characteristics are inconsistent with contamination and consistent with a single organism's genomic architecture. Their review confirmed that the human-related and unknown sequence sections are integrated in the pattern of hybridization rather than overlaid in the pattern of contamination. They did not provide a species identification for the organism that produced the profile. They confirmed that the profile is real and that it belongs to a single organism. The evolutionary biologists who reviewed the unknown sequence sections were the most careful and the most significant voices in the external assessment process. Their analysis of the unknown sequence's relationship to known primate genomic architecture produced a divergence timeline estimate, a calculation of how long ago the lineage that contributed the unknown sequences separated from the human-related lineage that contributed the other half of the mosaic profile. That estimate places the divergence at a point in the evolutionary record that predates the appearance of anatomically modern humans by a margin that is inconsistent with any known branch of the human family tree. The lineage contributing the unknown sequences is not a recently diverged human population. It is an ancient and entirely undocumented branch of the primate evolutionary tree whose existence has never appeared in the fossil record, never been represented in any prior genetic analysis, and whose only documentation in the entire scientific record is the mosaic profile recovered from a hair sample collected at a constructed shelter in a Pacific Northwest forest. The academic institutions approached with these findings have not published responses. Their silence is the loudest thing about this entire story. The DNA results do not contradict what the prior seasons documented. They explain it. Every thermal signature whose dimensions exceeded the biological reference range for known North American species now has a biological correlate. There is a species. It has a genome. Its evolutionary history had an enormous span of time to develop the behavioral sophistication, the territorial intelligence, the counter-surveillance capability, the apparent awareness of human investigation methodology that the prior seasons documented without being able to biologically ground. Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatological assessments of the construction evidence now have a subject. Ronnie LeBlanc's years of accumulated field intelligence were pointing at something whose existence the DNA has now formally established. The investigation built the evidence over seasons of rigorous fieldwork until the evidence was dense enough to drive a targeted sample collection that produced biological material whose analysis confirmed what the fieldwork was indicating. That is how science is supposed to work. Expedition Bigfoot did it correctly. And the result is the first formally documented biological evidence for an unknown primate species in North America that the forensic genetic record now contains. A DNA profile that should not exist is now in the forensic genetic record. The missing 411 disappearance pattern now has a biological candidate. The indigenous traditions that described these beings for generations now have a genomic foundation that Western science spent 2 centuries dismissing. The government's documented non-engagement with credible Bigfoot evidence becomes non-engagement with a species whose human-related ancestry raises questions about classification and rights that no agency has demonstrated any appetite for addressing. The Expedition Bigfoot results answer one question, the one that everything else depends on. Is there something out there? A forensic laboratory that processed a blind sample from a Pacific Northwest forest shelter confirmed that there is. It has a genome. It has been building shelters in those forests without appearing in any scientific record until this investigation arrived with the methodology rigorous enough to find it. It is still out there, and the results that confirmed its existence can no longer be made to disappear. Expedition Bigfoot has spent every season going further into the most remote wilderness corridors in North America than any prior Bigfoot investigation has been willing to go. They have documented thermal evidence, physical trace evidence, and acoustic recordings that the scientific community has never adequately addressed. But nothing in the show's prior history prepared the team for what approached them in the dark during this investigation. They did not finish the session. They left. And the footage captured before they did changes everything. Subscribe and stay until the end. Expedition Bigfoot occupies a specific and important position in the landscape of cryptid documentary television that distinguishes it from every comparable production operating in the same genre space. The paranormal and cryptid television market has never been short of content. The cable landscape has sustained an unbroken stream of Bigfoot-adjacent programming across multiple decades, ranging from the credible to the theatrical, whose collective effect on the public understanding of the evidence has been to dilute the serious research record with enough manufactured drama and ambiguous footage that the genuinely significant findings have difficulty being received with the weight they deserve. Expedition Bigfoot was built in deliberate opposition to that dilution. The show's foundational premise is that the evidence for a large, unknown bipedal primate in North American forest environments is substantial enough to warrant a research approach whose methodology reflects that substantiality. Not trail cameras positioned along popular hiking corridors, not investigators reacting to ambiguous sounds in the dark, but a systematic, technology-driven, scientifically grounded investigation conducted in the locations where the evidence is most concentrated, and by a team whose combined expertise gives the research operation credibility that the genre has historically struggled to claim. Ronnie LeBlanc's investigative background and his sustained personal engagement with the evidence base across years of independent research before the production began gives the show an investigative anchor whose knowledge of the prior evidence record goes deeper than any comparable presenter in the cryptid television space. Dr. Mireya Mayor's academic background as a primatologist and field researcher brings a scientific framework to the investigation that most paranormal productions conspicuously lack. The methodology of a working biologist applied to evidence whose significance her professional training gives her the tools to assess with a precision that general investigators cannot match. The combination of those two figures, supported by a research and technical team whose fieldwork capability extends the investigation's reach into terrain and conditions that standard documentary productions cannot access, has produced across the show's seasons the most credible body of documented Bigfoot field research ever captured for broadcast television. What the team encountered during the investigation that produced the footage, this video documents exceeded everything that prior credibility had prepared them for, and the footage they captured before they left is the reason this video exists. The specific location where the Expedition Bigfoot team conducted the investigation that ended in a full team departure was not selected through the standard development process that drives most television production location choices. It was selected at the end of a research process whose depth and rigor reflected the production's commitment to operating in the locations where the evidence was most concentrated, rather than in the locations that were most accessible or most visually suited to the documentary format. The location selection process for this investigation drew on 3 independent bodies of evidence that converged on the same geographic area from different research directions. The first was the physical evidence record, the accumulation of track castings, biological samples, and structural evidence from the area that the prior field research literature had documented across a span of decades without any systematic investigation having followed up on the individual findings comprehensively. The track castings from this area showed the dermal ridge detail and the anatomical proportions that the forensic literature on physical Bigfoot evidence identifies as markers of genuine biological impressions, and they were distributed across the area in a pattern consistent with a resident population whose territorial range centered on the specific drainage system the production identified as its primary investigation zone. The second body of evidence was the acoustic record. Recordings produced by independent researchers working the area across the prior decade documented vocalizations in the frequency ranges associated with large primate communication that the standard biological reference for the region's wildlife could not account for. The frequency analysis of those recordings, conducted by an audio specialist whose professional background in acoustic analysis was unconnected to cryptozoological research, produced findings consistent with a vocal apparatus significantly larger than any known North American animal species and carrying harmonic complexity inconsistent with any documented wildlife vocalization in the region. The third body of evidence was the witness testimony, the accumulation of independent encounter reports from hunters, forestry workers, and outdoor recreation users whose accounts of the area were consistent across independent observations, separated by years of time, and whose descriptions of what they had seen, heard, and physically encountered were detailed enough and specific enough to indicate genuine observation rather than the generalized impressions that misidentification produces. The convergence of those three independent evidence streams on the same geographic area is what the production identified as the most significant location indicator in the show's research history. It was the most evidentially supported single location the show had ever targeted for a full investigation deployment, and what that deployment produced exceeded everything the prior evidence record had suggested would be waiting there. The Expedition Bigfoot team arrived at the investigation location with the full weight of the production's technical capability deployed: the thermal imaging infrastructure, the acoustic monitoring network, the track documentation equipment, and the biological sample collection resources that the show's prior seasons had developed into the most sophisticated Bigfoot field investigation toolkit in the history of organized research into the phenomenon. The deployment methodology reflected the lessons the prior seasons had accumulated about how the subject behaved in relation to investigation activity, the awareness of human presence that the prior field evidence consistently indicated, the behavioral sophistication that the track pattern analysis and the acoustic record suggested, and the specific environmental conditions under which encounter probability was highest based on the accumulated field data. The baseline documentation conducted across the investigation's initial phase established an environmental profile for the target zone that the technical team's field notes describe as unlike anything the prior season's investigation deployments had produced. The acoustic sensors logged vocalizations in the infrasound range within the first hours of the deployment that the production's audio specialist identified as structural, not random low-frequency noise but organized sound whose internal patterning was consistent with communication rather than incidental environmental production. The thermal cameras covering the perimeter of the camp logged the first anomalous heat signatures at the edge of the tree line before the team had completed their initial site assessment, signatures whose dimensions and movement characteristics the operator flagged in real time as inconsistent with any animal in the biological reference database for the region. The track documentation team working the creek drainage adjacent to the primary camp position found fresh evidence of activity in the soft ground along the bank whose characteristics, the size, the stride pattern, the pressure distribution, were consistent with the physical evidence record that had driven the location selection, and whose freshness indicated that whatever had produced it had been in the area within hours of the team's arrival. The subject of the investigation knew the team was there before the team had finished setting up, and the signs it was producing in response to their presence were not the incidental byproducts of an animal going about its ordinary activity. They were deliberate, they were directed, and they were escalating. The investigation's night sessions are the operational core of the Expedition Bigfoot methodology, the periods when the thermal imaging capability is most relevant, when the acoustic monitoring is most productive, and when the behavioral evidence from the prior field research suggests encounter probability is highest. The night session that produced the footage this video documents began with the same systematic deployment the production's prior seasons had established as standard procedure: thermal cameras covering the primary approach corridors, acoustic sensors running across the full frequency spectrum, the team positioned at the locations the prior day's evidence collection had identified as the most active zones of the investigation area. The first hour of the session produced evidence in every instrument category that the technical team's field notes describe as the most concentrated body of simultaneous anomalous readings any single Expedition Bigfoot investigation session had previously generated. The acoustic sensors logged a progression of vocalizations beginning at the perimeter of the investigation area and moving systematically closer across the first 40 minutes of the session, a progression whose directional consistency and whose escalating proximity the audio specialist documented as indicating deliberate movement toward the team's position rather than the random distribution of an animal moving through its territory. The thermal cameras confirmed the directional movement the acoustic data was tracking. Heat signatures at the tree line, initially at the outer range of the camera's resolution capability, then progressively closer as the session advanced, moved with the purposeful, fluid locomotion that the prior season's encounter footage had established as the thermal signature of the subject the investigation was deployed to document. The ground was soft enough in the primary approach corridor to preserve the physical trace of the movement the cameras were tracking, and the track documentation equipment running in that corridor logged impressions whose freshness and whose anatomical detail gave the investigation a real-time physical record of the subject's approach that the prior seasons had never achieved simultaneously with active thermal and acoustic documentation. Everything was aligned. Every instrument category was producing consistent, corroborating data. The investigation was performing exactly as the methodology had been designed to perform. And then, at the 51-minute mark of the session, the data changed in a way that the methodology had not been designed to account for. The change in the investigation data at the 51-minute mark of the night session is the pivot point of the banned episode footage and the specific development whose character produced the team's departure decision. The thermal cameras covering the primary approach corridor had been tracking movement at the tree line for 40 minutes, movement whose proximity had been increasing incrementally across that period in a pattern consistent with a subject methodically closing the distance between itself and the investigation team's position. At 51 minutes, the incremental pattern ended. The thermal signature that had been approaching from the tree line was no longer at the tree line. The camera covering the primary approach corridor registered its presence at a distance from the team's position that the 40 minutes of incremental approach had not prepared anyone monitoring the data to expect. The distance had collapsed in a single movement whose speed the camera's frame rate captured without any intermediate frames showing the transition, present at the tree line in one frame, present at the investigation team's position in the next. The acoustic sensors logged a simultaneous change at the same moment, not an escalation of the vocalization pattern that had been building across the session, but a cessation. The structured infrasound communication that had been running continuously since the session began stopped at 51 minutes with a completeness that the audio specialist's field notes describe as more significant than any vocalization the sensors had recorded. Silence in this context was not the absence of activity. It was a specific communication. Something had decided the distance was no longer necessary. The thermal profile of what the cameras documented at close range at 51 minutes is the element of the footage that has been described by every person who has reviewed it with the most careful and the most consistent language. It is large. Larger than the team, larger than the prior season's thermal documentation had established as the upper range of the subject's documented size profile. Its heat distribution is consistent with a large warm-blooded organism whose core temperature and peripheral thermal radiation pattern are unlike any known species in the reference database the production's thermal imaging specialist had consulted across the prior seasons. And it was stationary, not moving toward the team, not moving away, standing between the team's position and the tree line in a stillness that the prior encounter footage had never documented in a subject at this proximity. The stillness of something that had reached the distance it intended to reach and was occupying it with a patience and a deliberateness that communicated more clearly than any behavior the prior investigation record contained what its purpose at that distance was. The Expedition Bigfoot team's response to what the cameras documented at 51 minutes into the night session is captured in the footage with an intimacy that the production's camera deployment, multiple units covering the team's position as well as the approach corridor, makes unusually comprehensive. The initial response of every team member in the frame at the 51-minute mark is consistent across every independent account of the session that has surfaced. A simultaneous shift in the quality of attention that the team was directing toward the investigation that preceded any verbal communication about what the data was showing. The people in that footage did not look at an instrument reading and then react. They were already reacting before anyone had said anything about what the instrument showed. Whatever the thermal cameras documented at 51 minutes at close range was not only visible in the camera data, it was present in the environment of the investigation area in a way that the team members closest to the primary approach corridor were registering through senses that the instrument data was only confirming. Dr. Mayor's response is the most analytically significant element of the team's documented behavior during the relevant period, not because it is the most dramatically visible, but because her professional professional background gives it the most evidential weight. A primatologist with field research experience across multiple continents, whose professional career has required sustained close proximity to large primate species in their natural environments, responding to what was present in the investigation area at 51 minutes with the specific quality of physical stillness that the cameras document, is communicating something about the nature of what was there that her decades of professional experience with known primate species had not produced in any prior field context. The decision to end the session was not made through the standard production protocol of a director communicating an editorial decision to the team. It was made by the team simultaneously, and without the verbal coordination that group decisions normally require. Every account of the decision that has surfaced describes it the same way. Not a decision that was reached, but a decision that was already made before anyone articulated it. The equipment was packed in a sequence whose efficiency communicated the team's collective understanding that the pace of the departure was not negotiable. The cameras kept rolling through the packing process and through the team's movement out of the investigation area. What they captured in the frames between the departure decision and the moment the team reached the vehicles is the element of the footage that has been described by people who have reviewed it as the most significant evidence the session produced, because in those frames, what had been standing between the team and the tree line at 51 minutes was still there. The body of evidence produced by the Expedition Bigfoot investigation session before the team's departure represents the most comprehensive simultaneous documentation of large unknown primate activity in the history of organized Bigfoot field research. And it is comprehensive precisely because the methodology the production had developed across its prior seasons was running at full deployment capacity when the subject closed the distance at 51 minutes. The thermal imaging data from the session establishes a heat signature profile for the subject that the production's thermal imaging specialist has described in the technical documentation as outside every reference category in the database while being internally consistent. The same profile, the same heat distribution pattern, the same dimensional characteristics across every camera angle and every frame of the relevant sequence. The consistency of the profile across independent camera units eliminates every artifact and equipment anomaly explanation for what the cameras documented. The acoustic data from the session establishes a vocalization record whose frequency analysis is consistent with the prior research literature's findings on Bigfoot acoustic evidence, a vocal production capability exceeding the range of any known North American animal, carrying harmonic complexity inconsistent with any documented wildlife vocalization, and organized with the internal structure that the prior acoustic research identified as communication rather than incidental sound production. The track evidence documented in the primary approach corridor establishes a physical record of the subject's movement toward the team's position that is consistent across every forensic measure the documentation equipment applied to it. The dermal ridge detail in the freshest impressions confirms biological production. The pressure distribution analysis confirms the mass and the locomotion pattern the thermal data independently establishes, and the stride pattern analysis confirms the directional movement the acoustic data tracked across the first 40 minutes of the session. 3 independent evidence streams, thermal, acoustic, and physical, all documenting the same subject in the same location across the same time period, producing results that are mutually consistent and that none of the conventional explanations available for any individual stream can account for when applied to the full body of evidence the session generated. This is the evidential standard that the Bigfoot research community has been working toward across decades of organized field investigation. The Expedition Bigfoot session produced it, and what the team encountered at 51 minutes when the subject closed the distance is the reason the footage from that session is the most significant thing the show has ever captured. The Expedition Bigfoot session footage was presented to a carefully selected group of researchers whose backgrounds in relevant disciplines, thermal imaging analysis, acoustic research, primate biology, and forensic track analysis, gave them the technical framework to engage with the evidence in each of its categories with professional rigor. The selection process was designed to exclude researchers whose prior public positions on the Bigfoot question would have given either their positive or negative assessments a credibility problem in the broader research community. What was wanted was not validation from committed believers or dismissal from committed skeptics. What was wanted was the technical assessment of professionals whose prior public record gave them no institutional investment in either direction. The thermal imaging analysis conducted by the specialist engaged for that review produced findings whose specific language, carefully chosen by a professional who understood the implications of every word, established that the footage was authentic, that the heat signature documented in the relevant sequence had no conventional explanation in the thermal imaging reference literature, and that the profile characteristics of the signature were inconsistent with every known species in every database the analyst had access to. The acoustic analysis produced findings consistent with the prior research literature on Bigfoot vocalizations, while exceeding the evidential quality of every prior acoustic sample in that literature in terms of recording clarity, frequency resolution, and the comprehensiveness of the concurrent documentation that allowed the vocalizations to be analyzed in the context of the full investigation data rather than as isolated recordings. The track analysis produced the most conservative characterization of the three. Forensic track analysts are professionally trained to resist conclusions that exceed the evidence, and the analyst engaged for this review applied that training consistently. What they would say was that the impressions documented in the primary approach corridor were consistent with a large bipedal primate whose foot morphology did not match any known species, and whose mass and locomotion pattern the pressure distribution analysis established at levels inconsistent with human production. What they would not say was what species had produced them. That restraint is itself the most scientifically honest response available to the evidence, and it is more significant, coming from a forensic professional applying rigorous methodology, than any unqualified confirmation would have been. Expedition Bigfoot went further than any prior investigation. The prior seasons built the methodology. This session used it. What came out of the dark to meet the team at 51 minutes is on camera. The question the show has been asking since season 1 has an answer. It came to them.